Rachel Seneschal. I'm the Program Development Coordinator here at the library. Really always happy to work with Katie and Steve and other people as part of the Borealis group, Center for Circumpolar Studies. Every series that you do here is always wonderful, and I always appreciate having you here, Stephen, and the rest of the group, because these presentations are really very high quality. And tonight's the first time we do a program at 5:30. I hope that more people come, and that may disrupt what's going on, but we will start. And please help me welcome Katie Osgood and Steve Blumenauer.
Well, it's really a pleasure to come, and we love coming to the Kellogg-Hubbard Library, even though it's so cold tonight and it's a little bit hard to come out at 5:30. And this lecture that we're doing tonight is probably like the fundamental lecture that in some way or another, every student should know some of these things that we're talking about. What constitutes the North, how do we conceive it, and who lives there. So this is the foundation for a very short course that we'll be offering, we hope in the fall, giving you a lot of basics, and this is an overview of that. We have quite a few materials here. We've got a PowerPoint lecture up here, and we're going to be working through it. Steve and I have done quite a few things together, so we riff off one another pretty well. We have a nice map here of the circumpolar world that's really helpful. I might take it down and pass it around if people want it. We've got 4 books up here that we'll be referring to on and again and off again. The one here on the left is by Steve, To the Arctic. It's probably the best introduction to the northern environment going. And probably the thing that I like about it is that it's so readable. And this new history of the Arctic that just came out last year by John McCannon, who was a Soviet scholar and actually has done a circumpolar survey, is also recommended because it is so readable. So you've got these 2 wonderful books right there. Then we have 2 others here. Some of you may have read Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams, Desire and Imagination in a Northern Landscape. But if you don't know Barry Lopez or don't know his writing, it's again, superlative, very fine meditations on what it means to desire something or imagine it, and then to project yourself into that landscape. So it's a very environmentally conscious piece, but looking at how people have understood the North. And this last one is really interesting, although it was written in 1996. It's the thoughts of Jean Mallory, who's a French anthropologist and has done work all across Greenland and North America with Inuit people. And he's very political. He's really sharp. And it's beautifully translated. So we've got 4 great books. And I actually want to start with a little piece right here from Arctic Dreams. The first chapter is called Arcticos. You want to say anything about Arctic, the word Arctic?
Well, I suppose if we're going to have start off with a basic course, you want to define the word and where it comes from. And of course, the original word is Arctos, which means bear in Greek. So it's the land of the bear, and the land of the bear, of course, has to do with the fact that it's the land under the Great Bear, actually the 2 bears, which we're looking at right now. And as you go farther north, the bears are more and more evident, particularly during the winter. So it has a long history.
It's a long history. So this first chapter is called Arcticos, from that Greek word, and it's very evocative of place. On a winter afternoon, a day without sunrise, under a moon that had not set for 6 days, I stand on the frozen ocean, 20 miles off Cape Mammon, Mackenzie King Island. The sea ice of Hazen Strait is not completely featureless. but its surface does not show either any evidence of severe torture, as one would find, for example, in the Lincoln Sea. The currents are relatively calm here. During the 9 or 10 months the water is frozen, this platform hardly moves. This was written in 1987, so the change in sea ice is one of the key things. He's really far north. To the south, I can see a thin streak of violet and cobalt sky stretching across 80 degrees of the horizon, but the ice and snow barely reflect these colors. The pervasive light here is the milky blue of the reflected moon. It is possible to see 2 or 3 miles in the moonlight, but the pale light gives nothing an edge, except for the horizon to the south, the color of a bruise. The world is only moonlit ice and black sky. The sky has no depth because of the fullness of the moon, but the stars shine brightly. The stars have caused me to pause in the middle of my walk. Polaris, the North Star, is directly overhead. Whenever before I have located the Big Dipper in the sky and followed the imaginary line through its indicator stars to find Polaris, I have been looking up to the north, into a northern sky. This afternoon, I look straight up. It is a celestial accident but that Polaris is located over the Earth's geographic North Pole. There is no comparable South Pole star. It seems to sit precisely on an extension of the Earth's axis, and it has shifted its position so little in our time, we think of it as a constant. It nearly is. It has been steady enough to anchor routes of navigation for people in the northern hemisphere for as long as history records. Astronomers call the mathematical point in the sky above the North Pole the North Celestial Pole, and Polaris is within a degree of it. I'm going to read a little bit more of this later, but this idea that all of your perceptions change considerably when you come out of the temperate zone where we live and you go farther to the north. So we're looking at definitions of who is in the north and what constitutes the circumpolar world. This is kind of an iconic photograph that has been making its way around like an urban legend of polar bears that are not having enough fast ice from which they can hunt. So it's become kind of a symbol for what is happening in the north.
I guess it's worth saying that the polar bear is Ursus maritimus, which of course means bear of the sea, and its close relative is Ursus arctos, which means bear. That's the grizzly bear or brown bear. You call it a grizzly bear in North America, but like so many other things, it's actually circumpolar. If anywhere you go in the north, you'll run into brown bears, with the exception maybe of east of Hudson Bay. They're gone from there, at least at the moment. Brown bears and polar bears are, although they look very different, are actually quite close relatives. And in fact, it's close enough to where occasionally if a brown bear and a polar bear of the proper gender get together, you end up with sort of pale brown bears, even in the wild. And one of the things they're worried about with the polar bears is not necessarily that they will disappear because of climate change, but more that they may disappear, at least in many places, by hybridization with the brown bears. And pure polar bears are likely to become rarer and rarer. This probably isn't going to really happen because although we're really worried about the polar bears in some places, and particularly in the places where they're most available, like in the west side of Hudson Bay, they're in real trouble because it's sort of in the southern edge of their range, and we're losing a lot of the features that they need to. What we're really doing is losing enough ice so it shortens down the season they can get enough to eat, and that particularly interferes with the females and the cubs who have to travel farther to get things to eat. So we may well be in trouble with polar bears in places like that. But if you go farther north up into the Canadian Arctic, it's not looking as desperate as one might have been told, although it's something we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and I think there are several things that come up with this heading. Why should we even study the circumpolar world? But one is, when you look at an image like this, are we looking at a dire disaster facing all of humankind? Or are we looking at something that is much more subtle and complex, as Steve has kind of outlined for us, that there are places where they may be imperiled, other populations that may not be, and there are other things going on as well. So to take a single animal and to use that as the entire context is misleading in a way. So in a way, what we're looking at is how to give you to provide sufficient context to understand the massive changes that really are going on in the north. So, and this is a picture from Finnish Lapland, and by my friend Pekka Samalahti, and he calls it Kivi siellä jossain, a rock somewhere there. And I think the thing that I like about his photographs, although they're somewhat manipulated, is they give you a really good sense of the dramatic landscape that you're looking at that is quite different. When you get to tundra and when you get to Arctic ice, you're looking at different landscapes. And this idea that where we are, Ultima Thule, is an idea that is beyond this place. So that's a very ancient thought that comes to us from long ago. The idea that there is a place beyond the known world which is the ultimate destination. And that has been one of the ways that the circumpolar world has been imagined.
Katie and I have talked about this, and I hadn't actually seen these images in the sequence before, so it's kind of fun actually to as you say, riff off them. One of the things that we always have in mind when we're talking about the North is glaciers, and particularly the history of glaciation, since, as you know, glaciers have come and gone a lot in the last million years or so. And in fact, at one point you could have said the Arctic extended all the way down to the south of France. But one of the ways you know that you're in North Country often has to do with whether it's glaciated. And this is a perfect example of how you would know that this is well, certainly a glacial erratic, something that was carried by a glacier, which then simply melted away and dropped whatever it was carrying on the surface of the land. So when you see this sort of a landscape, and there's some other clues in there too, which I suspect we're going to get a better look at later, that are going to tell you right off that it's glaciated. I suppose that it's, when we're going to, a little bit farther along, talk about Siberia, or you're going to see some maps of the circumpolar north. And one of the things that's really interesting and curious is that we think of the north as being glaciers. As you travel into Siberia, actually a lot of it has never been glaciated, and that has a lot of interesting outcomes that affect both the past and the present and the people who live there and other things, and so we'll talk about them.
I always hate putting these kinds of maps up, but what we're looking at is the number of degrees of temperature change in the north by 2090. That's just, let's see, what is that, 76 years from now? Is that right? Did I do my math right? Anyway.
486.
Some time from now, but not in my lifetime, I hope. But the thing that's really interesting is that as you go further north, the degree of climate change is accelerated. And that is a really curious feedback effect. I'm not the scientist here, so I should probably refer to you.
Well, I think that of course, one of the questions here is always how good are these models, and what do they mean? They're scary. Whatever they say, they all say something scary. It's more a matter of how scary than anything else. The interesting thing here is you see the big dark area, and that is in the area which historically and presently is affected by the North Atlantic Drift, which of course is the the tag end of the Gulf Stream, and so which comes, of course, just up by up a little on the other side of Iceland there. Anyhow, this is why you can live in Norway at 60 degrees north and be in a temperate region, and at the same latitude in Labrador, you're truly in the Arctic. And as you go farther north into Svalbard, which is the big island group above Norway, even now it's comparatively warm for a high latitude place. But if that map is in any way accurate, Svalbard, which is now pretty heavily glaciated, is going to look a lot different in 2090.
It's probably worthwhile reading here from A History of the Arctic. This is John McCannon's piece, and he ends with trying to project from a historical point of view rather than a scientific point of view what the future may be. But you can't really write the future history without thinking about science. And he's saying, is there such a thing as Arcticide? So the actual end of the Arctic.
Arcticide,
killing the Arctic. As they have throughout the modern era, pollution, overhunting, and human encroachment on animal habitats continue to inflict enormous stress on the northern environment. These days, although the Arctic's most alarming problem is its shrinking albedo. And Steve's going to explain.
Albedo?
Yeah.
Anybody know what albedo is? Well, what it is it's reflectivity. And of course, when you have a lot of glaciers and in a long winter with a snow cover, a lot of the solar energy is going to be reflected back into space. And if you turn this tundra area, which is snow cover for 9 months of the year, into a boreal forest region, which is covered with snow for 6 months of the year, and which is much darker because of the evergreen foliage, you change the albedo, and what you do is create a feedback loop so that once you warm up to a certain amount, it's a self-perpetuating process. The same thing can be said of the Arctic Ocean itself. Obviously, if it's covered with ice, it reflects very nicely. If it's covered with water, the water will absorb a great deal more radiation, and so again, you create this feedback loop, which is once you've got it started, it's very hard to stop.
Yeah, and John McCannon continues, for millennia, albedo, the coefficient that measures surface reflectivity, remained high in the far north, where the preponderance of ice and snow ensured that most of the sun's light and warmth were thrown back skyward. Lately, however, with temperatures rising and the ice and snow less prevalent, the northern lands and waters, rather than reflecting heat, have been absorbing much more of it. The ease with which this has spun into a vicious cycle is plain to see. The more heat the Arctic retains, the more ice and snow it loses for good, making it even more liable to retain heat. Put bluntly, the warmer the Arctic gets, the warmer it will keep becoming. Those who are blasé or skeptical about global warming shrug this off as part of the normal order of things, as merely one phase of a long-term climatological cycle. It seems far likelier, though, that we are witnessing and surely abetting a colossal act of what can fairly be called Arcticide. Of course, the Arctic in some form will exist for as long as the planet remains intact. But the Arctic as we know it now is dying, or if it does die, it will not have been of natural causes. He doesn't mince any words, and it's kind of quite a scary scenario.
Yeah. There's a number of things here of real importance, and let me just mention a couple of them. One of the first ones is that the Arctic as we know it is a relatively new phenomenon. If you went back a few million years, which is a kind of a drop in the bucket, the Arctic would look so different that it would be unrecognizable. You probably would have very little tundra. The tundra would occur more in mountainous regions, and at least until fairly recently, people believed that the polar bear was actually one of the most recent species to evolve. There was a theory suggesting that polar bears as a species were only a little over 100,000 years old. I think they pushed polar bears back by at least a few 100,000 years now. But it is a fact that a lot of the things that we think of as being typically Arctic, in fact, have come into existence pretty recently, including in some ways the whole, what we think of as the Arctic environment. Now, having said all that, don't by any means misquote me and suggest, therefore, that I'm not a believer in climate change, because I am, and I have good reason to be. But it is interesting to look at it over very long periods of time and realize that that the world, even left to itself, does some pretty dramatic things, including creating and conceivably destroying the Arctic as we think of it as well.
This is another graphic that shows some of the same things, but here we're only looking at from 1979 through 2013. And although it's a little bit off the screen here, you can see that the red line is your January extent of sea ice volume, so you can see that there is a definite shrinking of it. But as a sometime graphic designer, I think this is a fantastic graphic because you've got the spiral going on here. So it'll be very interesting to see if there are significant changes of any kind going on in the future. So it'll be interesting to see this fellow Andy Lee Robinson, if he picks it up in a couple years and where it comes from. What we have here is a slide from Hangnatuk of open water. And this was, one of my students sent it to me. She was an online student with the University of the Arctic, and they were all pretty excited because it was spring breakup. This line between ice and water is a really interesting one to study. And it's one that lets you kind of determine access to marine resources. Sometimes you need ice to get to them, or you need open water, but the worst is breakup, where you can't really get from place to place. So mobility in the north is another issue that we can look at in a little bit. Oh, here we have, again, we're just about 7 billion people on the face of the earth, and one of the things that we need to keep us going is energy. So resource development is a key item. We know that that there is a great deal of ice in the Arctic. Let me see, I've got some figures here. This is a map from the U.S. Geological Survey, and they estimate that there are about 90 billion barrels of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil, 1,670 trillion cubic feet of technically recoverable natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of technically recoverable natural gas liquids in 25 geologically defined areas thought to have potential for petroleum. So we can look at some of these. We're not going to, this could be an entire lecture on its own. I'm no expert, but one of the things that's most interesting to me is someone who studies the work, the writings of indigenous peoples, the responses to resource development. And we have several areas that are incredibly important. Here we have Scandinavia, and this is northwest Russia here. And Norway, Statoil, is developing very important resources here in collaboration with Russia. We've got I think it's the Stockman field that's the big one that's getting developed right there. And the other one that I know to say something about is right up here, which would be the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, where heretofore there is no drilling, but it's open for discussion. And immediately to the east is Mackenzie Delta,
right, okay.
Which is there's active negotiations with indigenous peoples along the Mackenzie River area to develop the Mackenzie River Delta. But you wanted to say something about Prudhoe Bay, perhaps?
Well, it's interesting. I actually was in that area in the North Slope, which is very close to what's now was Prudhoe Bay, before they ever claimed before they ever claimed that there was really oil and gas there, but there was an awful lot of BP people floating around in small aircraft, drilling here and being very quiet. And a year or two later, they had the discovery well. And it's, again, I could spend hours on this literally, but the interesting thing from our perspective maybe is that how this affects a local indigenous population. Because, of course, the people of the North Slope are now probably the richest indigenous people in the world. You had villages which, when I was first up there, were not even villages. They were places where people congregated at certain times of the year, and now they have Olympic swimming pools and things like that. It's just a radical change, and it's very hard to blame people who have been living hand to mouth for quite a few generations to when these riches are suddenly available to them. It's hard to say, well, gee, they really shouldn't take them. They should go right on hunting walruses. But it does raise some really interesting questions, which I suspect you're going to have a lot to talk about in your later lectures.
Yeah, and another thing that, well, actually, this next slide probably gives us a better opportunity to talk about it. But the United States has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which for a number of reasons. We have a standing boundary dispute with Canada right there between Alaska and Canada. And we also have not come to, there has not been a resolution about Russian claims to a larger portion of the maritime resources that we see. But there are some more images later. This one is here because it shows a number of the sea routes that are increasingly becoming viable through the Northwest Passage, which would be this one here, and the Northern Sea Route going across the top of Siberia. And those have enormous potential for taking freight and oil or other resources through those areas. Of course, you're looking at, in the Northern Sea Route across this, the Soviets did develop quite a lot of infrastructure. There are harbors, there are fueling stations, there are other things, but they're very derelict at this point. Oh, speaking of derelict, if you listen to the music that was playing when you first came in, it's a very curious young Danish band which likes to go out and take sound recordings of interesting places. And they went up to, is this Franz Josef Land up here?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm pointing you to the right place. Franz Josef Land, where there had been, I think, a big coal mine, and it was abandoned by the Soviets.
No, that was in Svalbard.
That was
I don't think there may be one in
it was a big Soviet installation. I'm pretty sure it's Franz Josef, but anyway, a big installation that was derelict, and there were a lot of big storage tanks and curious buildings that were made out of unusual materials. So they went up and they would take drumsticks and they would sample things off the big oil tanks and that kind of thing. And then they took those sound samples and kind of did these rap lyrics on top of them. It's a very, very evocative set of music, and their intention was to let us hear the soundscape of an abandoned northern industrial site.
Yeah, of which there are a lot in the former Soviet Union.
Yes.
The thing I'd add in here that's interesting to me is that if you had this on a map that went farther south, you'd be aware that that Northern Sea Route, or actually both these routes, but particularly the Northern Sea Route, is a much shorter way to get from China to Europe than the usual ways. And so what's happening here is the Arctic used to be thought of as being kind of under the control of 8 Arctic nations. But as the sea opens up and trade routes open and things like that, as well as the possibility of petroleum, the number of nations that are interested in the Arctic for various reasons gets considerably larger. And so there's a bigger community with all kinds of different kinds of nations with different interests. and we're likely to see in the next few decades some kind of interactions that have the potential to be fairly unpleasant and probably aren't going to necessarily take into all that much consideration what's best for the countryside itself, or in this case for the seas itself. As a sidelight to that, and I have to count on you, Katie, to shut things off if we go too long. But later on we'll talk a bit about some of the rivers in Russia. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of the industrial waste of not just Russia but other countries as well, for various reasons, has found itself into the Arctic. There's all kinds of interesting and generally unpleasant stories about this. It involves not just marine things but also air pollution and things like that. But some of that most pristine area in the world that you would see in some of these slides is in fact also some of the more heavily polluted part of the world, even though it's the kind of pollution that you only would find if you brought your samples back to the lab and realized you've been drinking some awful stuff, or that there was lots of radionucleotides floating around there that you don't know about unless you have a Geiger counter or something.
Yeah, I like to, when I'm in Finnish Lapland, which seems a very pristine place, you'll be, up in the air is really, really fine, and I like to take and sample the water in different places, and some of it's very brown because it's tannic, and it really tastes good, and then you'll realize, oh my word, there's a Nazi bunker over there with rolls of barbed wire left over from World War II. And then you look over there and you go, oh my word, there's the big national boundary fence between Norway and Finland that's almost 10 feet tall to keep the Finnish reindeer in Finland and the Norwegian reindeer in Norway. So the water does taste really good, but the idea that we have a completely unpeopled or untrammeled or unproductive landscape does not bear witness. Let's keep going here, because we haven't even gotten into the good stuff yet. So the other thing to think about, Steve mentioned earlier that there is the Arctic 8, and we'll talk a little bit about the Arctic Council later, but there are 8 Arctic stakeholders. What was really interesting to me right now is that prior to 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, there were really 2 Arctics. There was a Soviet Arctic and the European and North American Arctic. And although there was a little bit of scientific exchange, there was very little shared knowledge or shared cooperation. That situation is very dynamic now. Russia has one of the biggest interests, as you can see, across the top here. It's the largest country of the Arctic 8, and it is claiming very large portions of the Arctic Ocean. This is critical because of the resources that are there. I have a little image of the Lomonosov Ridge, which you can see running there right by the North Pole. And let me run that by just to give you kind of a visualization of the sea floor. But here, if you're looking, this is coming from Russia towards Greenland. And this is, maybe you can explain it better than I can.
Well, it's like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's a function of plate tectonics.
And their claims to these larger portions of the Arctic Ocean here are based on the fact of the Lomonosov Ridge, which they are claiming is an extension of the continental Siberia. Is that?
Yeah, it gets tricky because the continental shelf is open to different definitions. So the U.S. in Alaska there is basically claiming or concerned with the continental shelf, and you see it's relatively narrow. But as you get deeper drilling capabilities or are able to drill in deeper water, then it behooves you to expand your idea of what the continental shelf is, and I think that's what's going on with the Russians.
And Greenland too, which, you know, when we used to have Mercator projections on classroom walls, it looked pretty big, but it is big. And it is a potential, there's a lot of potential resources in Greenland, which were being used by Denmark as a colony, but it is beginning to, it doesn't have complete authority over its own resources yet, although they're beginning to look at that. And the idea that Greenland is claiming a great deal of its continental shelf is an important one also. There's an ongoing border dispute on a little tiny island, I think it's right about there, is that it? Between Greenland and Canada, and the island is really of no merit, but the boundary has major significance in terms of establishing resource claims. So this little graphic, which comes from the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, which was established to try to mitigate some of the major pollution left over in the Soviet development of their north, demonstrates how pollution that originates here ends up there. And I can't explain very well how it happens, but I know it does.
Yeah, again, it's a long story. I think the comment I'd make there is that for years, people in northern Alaska would talk about Arctic haze and claim that the sky was getting to be, that the visibility was diminishing over long distances. And as you know, that you can often see very long distances in the Arctic, particularly because light's refracted somewhat, and so you get these what's the word I want? Mirages, right? It would, but this was getting less and less over time, and it turned out that a lot of this was from industrial plants in Russia, in the Soviet Union in those days, and it was very clear that things were traveling long distances, and the whole Arctic was being afflicted.
I forget the exact story, but there's an Arctic explorer in the 19th century. I think he's British. And he's somewhere in the far north, and he's saying, what is all this black stuff on the snow? And they couldn't determine the source of it. And he managed to take samples home. Well, heck, it was coal dust coming from England and from continental Europe. So he was able to demonstrate that there were, let's see, so what are they saying? Contaminant emissions transported by air. He was able to demonstrate that. But for whatever reason, his findings didn't get a lot of credibility. But now that people look back at what he was telling us, we've known this for quite some time. And this last one in our beginning, I don't want everything to be dire, because the reason I like to talk about the circumpolar world is I think it's a place of compelling beauty and rejuvenation and wonderful potential for understanding international cooperation, many other things. So I kind of feel sad about having quite so many distressing images, but it's worth remembering these things as we look at those very beautiful images too. So this is looking at deaths per 1,000 live births before reaching the age of 1. And you can see that in some places, the indigenous peoples, which are the green columns, are much higher, both in Russia and in Canada and Greenland. It's really amazingly bad. Interestingly enough, in Finnmark in Norway, where you have socialized medicine. There's still a significant statistical difference between indigenous what's the right word for that? But anyway, live births, infant mortality, and Norwegian infant mortality. And that has a lot to do with food supplies, with ways of going about, with the bioaccumulation of toxins to the north. Okay, that was all introduction. So now, now we'll get to the meat of our presentation. We're going to look at the Arctic in 3 different ways: as an idea, as a concept, as an ecosystem, and as a homeland. And this is a picture of us when we were taking students, Steve and me, we were in Shetland. And I like it because we look so young. It wasn't that long ago either, was it? So the first thing we can talk about is the Arctic as an idea. And we have talked about that a little bit around this image of Pekka Sammalahtis with a glacial erratic. But the idea that there is a place beyond ours that has the potential for great beauty. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jean Mallory starts this really well. Let me see. I've got it marked, and if I don't, we'll go right on. No, I don't have it marked, so I won't dither here. We'll move on. So first we're looking at definitions of the Arctic, and we've got quite a few words that are going around. We've got Arctic, we've got the North, we've got the circumpolar world. And in all cases, the definition, the actual geographical definition of each of those terms may vary somewhat depending on the circumstances. Well, let me turn this over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, one of the first things to keep in mind is the whole idea of our modern definition of the Arctic is actually pretty new. It almost comes out, in a lot of ways, it almost comes out after World War II. And there's probably some reason for that. That is that after World War II, we suddenly decided that we had a different set of enemies, and they were looking at us over the top, and we were developing long-distance missiles and things like that. So that in the latter part of the 20th century, there was a great deal of renewed interest in the Arctic for defensive reasons, and that meant there was money for getting scientists up there and that sort of thing. And scientists tend to like definitions, so they generally came up with the idea that the northern regions maybe are best thought of as being the Arctic and the subarctic, and in many ways, they define the Arctic as essentially being the treeless tundra area, at least the terrestrial Arctic. And the maritime Arctic is a little trickier in some ways, but it's you usually know when you're there or when you're not. The subarctic then is the boreal forest region, and in this map here is one that probably was done by the social scientist. What you find, one of the things you'll notice though, is that the Arctic is actually a pretty small land area. It's a big ocean area, and it mostly is the land bordering the Arctic Ocean. The exception to this, in many ways, is the Canadian Arctic, and the reason for that is that it's very fragmented. It's a lot of islands with cold ocean waters running between them. So the summers are cold, and the lack of trees has a great deal to do with the summer temperatures. Essentially, if it doesn't get warm enough for trees to grow, you still will have grass and tundra, and so that works out pretty well for a definition of the terrestrial Arctic. And the marine Arctic is mostly enclosed by the land. The one which have a very hard time defining it is in the North Atlantic and to a lesser degree in the Bering Sea. The high Arctic and low Arctic is tricky words. It's sort of use them as you want to, but obviously the high Arctic is higher at higher latitudes than the low Arctic, but it's not a terribly meaningful thing. Now, the tree line shows up on there, and it's essentially is, as you can see, that the blue is the Arctic, the green is the subarctic, and the boundary between them is the tree line. Follows along with what I was saying before. And the one thing to keep in mind about all this is that the presence or absence of trees is almost perfectly correlated with summer temperatures, with the amount of summer warmth. It has very little to do with the annual temperatures and even less to do with winter temperatures. The trees just sort of hunker down during the winter like they're doing right out here now. And unless they're not resistant to cold, they do pretty well. So the coldest places in the world are not really in the Arctic. They're in the subarctic, and the coldest places, well, that's not true, Antarctica is colder, but the coldest non-glaciated inhabited places are in the subarctic, and they are mostly in Siberia, where weather like we're having now would be a warm spell. Even in a big city like Yakutsk, the mean temperature in January is something like about 30 below, 35 below Fahrenheit. It's pretty close to 30 below Celsius as well.
I spoke with Yakutsk on Sunday, minus 47 Celsius.
Minus 47, yeah. It sounds about right. Whereas in Barrow, for example, in Alaska, which is pretty well up into the Arctic, you see they kind of like to put it right in the borderline between high Arctic and low Arctic. It doesn't usually get much more than about 30 below. Cold enough, but not so cold. Another thing that's fun here is that you'll notice it doesn't show as well in this map in terms of latitude. You see the Arctic coming way down south here. And this has to do with the cold Greenland or the cold Labrador current coming down through there. So if you go even to southern Labrador or Newfoundland, you get into a very Arctic-like condition. And in fact, even down here, it gets kind of subarctic. Part of the reason for that long excursion there, particularly in some of the older maps, is there used to be the Strait of Belle Isle, which lies between Labrador and Newfoundland, is a very important shipping route because, of course, the Great Circle route from Europe to North America comes around through there and into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there used to be a weather station there on Belle Isle, which is this rocky, miserable island in the middle of the strait. And the weather conditions over the years made it actually technically within the Arctic regions. And so you'd have this long sort of tongue of Arctic hanging down into latitudes about the same as, say, London or something.
Mike, it's worth pointing out that the Arctic Circle, which, of course, is a perfect geographer's ruse for saying where the Arctic is, doesn't really define a lot of things. You can see that good portions of the low Arctic and subarctic are well below the Arctic Circle. So you don't have a nice round shape at all. And if we were able to zero in on these maps, you'd see a lot of local variation also. The 10-degree July isotherm is this one that runs just above and below the tree line. It's really curious to me how variable that one is. I think this map shows some of the things because it shows the nation states. It has a few other things, but we've got the tree line, right? That's the tree line, isn't it? Yep.
Of course, this kind of map has been around for quite a while. That's one of the ones that first got developed right after World War II, and the idea of the similarity between the correlation between timberline or tree line and the 10-degree isotherm. Of course, how many weather stations are there to help you draw the 10-degree isotherm? All the way across Canada, there might have been half a dozen stations within 100 miles of it, one way or the other. So it was probably pretty much drawn on the basis of, well, that's where the trees are. We've got aerial photos now. We can look down and see where the trees stop. So that's got to be the 10-degree isotherm.
Another way of conceptualizing the North is with commercial and political ideas. And this is from the year of the American independence, a view of the Northwest Passage. And there's so many things that are, it's really hard to even try to make sense of it. Here's California. And you can see that, that Canada's kind of squished in there. And there's Hudson Bay up there in the corner, but it looks like there's really good potential to go through. And of course, that is one of the things that so many explorers were trying to find their holy grail with the Northwest Passage, to prove that there were ways to the Orient through the North. And that's still a puzzle for many people.
You know, if you look on the maps that were published, say in the 1920s, they still show big blank places up in there. Until you had aerial photography, there was a lot of that countryside, particularly in the Canadian part, that was still just kind of a blank.
And there are evangelical reasons to define the Arctic because, of course, one of the tools of colonization is the church, and there were reasons. Many. This too would be a really interesting whole evening's discussion, because much of North America, for instance, was divided up among different missions: Anglican mission, the Catholic mission, the Moravian mission. And they all, they each had different approaches to the ways they interacted with people. Many times the missions were the source of education, source of health care, of trade goods, of many other things. But the distribution of different denominations across the Arctic has had some very interesting and profound effects upon definitions of peoples, of settlements, of many different types of things. Steve was talking earlier about how after World War II, there were very key reasons to define the Arctic in different ways. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the DEW line, the distant early warning line that's running across the top, which was meant to be a barrier to communist infiltration across the top. And see, I've got a little piece here from Jean Mallory, I think, that I'd like to read. Do you want to say anything about that?
And the DEW line was called, as a distant early warning was DEW line, was essentially to catch any Soviet bombers that might be coming across the north. So it was set up in the late 50s. And as you can see, there's a lot of them in there. They didn't have very good radar in those days. Later on, by the 70s and early 80s, they were worried more about missiles, and so they were setting up a different kind of site, which was both much more expensive and much more hush-hush. So you had what they call BMUS sites along there. And it's remarkable the number of places you can go into the Arctic and still see lots and lots of antennae of all sorts sticking up all over the place. You go into Nome. I haven't been there for 4 or 5 years. The last time I was in Nome, for years right outside Nome was this really massive set of some sort of antennae, and it had much bigger than that. And there was a big high fence around it, and there were soldiers standing there looking very serious, and you were, of course, close to Sarah Palin's backyard. You could close to looking over there. And I went back many years later, and the whole thing had been utterly abandoned, and you could walk into it, and you could see this huge masses of electronic equipment just sort of, the ceiling was dripping through, and the stuff was just strewn around. And I just think of how many millions and millions of dollars we spent in that awful thing. It's sitting there as a derelict.
This picture is pretty evocative also. This is from the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea of Russia. And they were first populated by Russian Orthodox monks who built this whole monastery there in the 1600s. Remarkable. They had their own brickworks. They made a massive water system, so there's running water in all the parts. They have a beautiful cathedral, but it was there as a defensive work, mostly against the British, who were very interested in developing this area too. So you had a religious establishment that was also serving a military purpose. And then during the Soviet era, it reverted to Moscow, and the first prison in the Gulag was here on the Solovetsky Islands. So there were prison barracks in all the old monks' spaces. And now this is being rebuilt as an Orthodox monastery, but it's also a communications center, which is why you're seeing all of the satellites here. But I want to read here from Jean Mallorese. This is the beginning of his piece, and he was up in northwest Greenland near Thule in 1950 to 1951. Northwest Greenland, 16 June 1951. 3 men are climbing a glacier with their dog sleds bound for the legendary polar village of Thule. 2 of them are Inuit, Sakaungak, the Chaman, and Kalasuk. The third is me. Our dress consists of animal skin coats, bearskin pants, and triple-layered boots of seal and bearskin, with an outer layer of caribou hide. We are returning from the Great Solitudes, the deserted lands of Ellesmere Island and Inglefield Land in North Greenland, where I have mapped uncharted coastline and plateaus at a scale of 1 to 100,000. Throughout my 14 months of solitude among the Inuit, I have listened, mesmerized, to the mythic tales of a free and happy people. Suddenly, Sakaungak draws the 3 of us to a halt. Visibility ahead is nil. With his knife, he beats out a rhythm on the cover of a metal can and raises his voice in an agonistic ayaya pork, a shamanic song. A great tragedy looms before us. I sense it. As we continue along our route, Martians come into view in the sky. Martians, that would be the United States Air Force, which is here in utter secrecy building the largest offensive air base the Arctic has ever seen. The assignment involves the construction of a runway for bombers targeting Peking and Moscow. It is the height of the Korean War, and Comrade Stalin has told Comrade Mao that the time has come to lay waste to capitalism. France and Britain are in no condition to fight while the United States is disarming. We'll need to deploy 500,000 Chinese soldiers, Comrade Mao. No, many more than that, against the American divisions in Korea. The Red Army will follow them into battle. Mao declines, viscerally distrustful of Moscow, and peace is secured for the time being. On the peninsula, the American troops and their allies begin to fall back, losing Seoul. Soon they will be driven to the beach of Pusan or to surrender. It is in this context that the Pentagon, in the winter of 1950, has decided that a secret weapon is called for. It has to be an aerial operation since the 100 ships dispatched the previous April are still iced in at Melville Bay to the south. I am the only foreign witness to this top-secret operation carried out without deigning to consult the 302 polar Inuit of Thule. The 3 of us and our dogs approach the tent of the general heading the operation, who comes out to greet us. Who gave a Frenchman clearance to be on this base, he snaps. I have recently killed a polar bear, and my hair is long. I might as well be emerging from another age. I stare at him, then respond in kind. And who gave you clearance to be on Inuit land, General?
That was his last mistake.
Yeah, so there are strategic and military reasons to define the Arctic. Right now, President Obama issued his latest policy for the Arctic last May, and in it there is a strategic command to increase military presence in response to Russian military presence in the Arctic, which they're developing at a very rapid rate. So to think of these places as being remote and unmapped is also misleading.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Of course, there are other ways to look at the North and humanistic ways. In the Hudson River School of Art and a number of other ones, this idea of finding ways that light could be reimagined and represented to us so that we could see ways of transfiguring human being. And one of the things they looked at was water, and another that they looked at was ice. So many of the so-called luminists made their ways very far north. And in this one, you have some really interesting contrasts between man and nature. You've got ideas coming out of the Romantic movement of the conflict between man and nature, little tiny human beings with this two-masted schooner here, this great massive landscape with the aurora borealis showing up mightily. Church was, he went to Labrador and spent quite a bit of time there, and other painters went to Greenland and other places and brought back their images in ways that were very, very important in the metropolis. So you have images that are quite magical, somewhat fanciful, and very powerful. And they are still in currency. They still have a lot of resonance for us. And in this image here, we have a reenactment of the Snow Queen, Hans Christian Andersen's telling of a northern tale, if there ever was one. This took place in Putney, and it was amazing. There were 5 or 6 different stations, and he went from scene to scene. And the idea of this female figure who is the epitome of cold and cruelty, and her power in disarming children of their innocence and taking away their humanity. And this confrontation is one that you see in many stories. In Grimm's fairy tales, you can find these themes. This is a really good. The Golden Compass is another great example of the North as a site of purity and cruelty, both side by side. You can also think of scientific definitions for the Arctic, and there have been 4 major international enterprises trying to map out scientific understandings of the North. The most recent concluded in 2009, but these were called International Polar Years. And the really interesting thing I think about them is the degree of collaboration that has come out as a result of lots of international teams working on particular problems.
Keep going.
Okay. Another way of defining the Arctic that perhaps you might have gotten a little bit of the Arctic in a study of mythology or a little bit of it in ethnography, but the idea of the Arctic as a region, as a space worthy of study on its own merits is relatively recent, as Steve was saying. And the Arctic Institute of North America is one of the longest established groups that has kind of coordinated and made research and made the findings public. You know a little bit more about it, I think, than I do.
What's interesting, they put out this journal Arctic, which goes, I think started in 1947. We used to have almost the whole thing. And, you know, if you went to the early issues of Arctic, there were about maybe a dozen people, it seemed like, that would be the authors. You know, everybody would have 2 or 3 papers a year, and it was a pretty small journal. And you know, you knew all the names of all the people who were working in the Arctic, mostly Americans and Canadians and Brits, lots of English, and usually a few Finns and Norwegians as well. And of course, the Russians. That was back in the days when Russians and Americans weren't publishing in the same journals. And the journal has come a long way since then, and now it's you know, you don't recognize any of the names. There are thousands of people working there. One of the nice things about it is that we did start interacting with the Russians a long time ago, and when the Cold War was still going strong, there was a lot of interaction between Russians and American scientists, and we had a lot of fun interacting.
I like to put up some artwork every so often, and this is a self-taught artist from Sodankylä in northern Finland, Andreas Alaristo, and he tried to, he wanted his paintings to be stories. So really, we shouldn't look at this as a painting like we look at Frederick Church's, but we should imagine what's going on here. And the idea is we have an errant reindeer here, the one that is, they really are not supposed to be here. These are naughty reindeer. And this poor herder is trying to figure out how he's going to get them out of this. They're very curious animals. Another feature we have, and we've got just 2 more here, but we talked about this earlier about the Arctic 8, the 8 Arctic nations that are now part of the Arctic Council, which came out, I think it started in 1995 after the Rovaniemi Declaration. So we've got the United States, but whenever we go to international conferences, instead of putting the US, they put Alaska on our name tag. We've got Canada. We've got Denmark, which is there not because it itself is an Arctic nation, but because it still has standing relationships with the Faroe Islands and with Greenland. Then we've got Iceland, we've got Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Fennoscandia, and the entire Russian Federation. What's important, interesting to know is that recently the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese have been accepted as have observer status on the Arctic Council. There are also permanent participants who are indigenous people with international distributions. So the Arctic Athabascan Council, both Alaska and Western Canada, have Athabascan people. The Aleut International Association, so Aleutian across the Aleutian Islands over to the Commodore Islands in Russia, the Gwich'in Council International, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is one of the oldest standing indigenous organizations going all the way from Chukotka in Russia to Greenland, and then the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, also known as RIPON, and this is a crazy story. You know, we have some really curious leaders in the Arctic 8 right now, and Putin is probably one of the most curious. He withdrew their right to association last year. It was last April. He said that they hadn't registered their trademark correctly, and so he pulled their right to, and there were international protests all around the world, and they were reinstated, but I think he was trying to say, look, you indigenous people, don't you talk out too much in Russia here. This is serious. So that's, and then we have the Sami Council in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. The University of Arctic is an organization to which the Center for Circumpolar Studies belongs, and it's part of the Arctic Council's mission to provide education in the North, for the North, by the North. And some of the courses, this is a course that this Borealis that we're working on, we're presenting to you, is a course that is likely to be used as a way for many people in northern Canada know nothing about Russia. Many people in Siberia know nothing about Greenland. So being able to have that shared knowledge of circumpolarity is a valuable thing. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Steve mostly here, because this is the we just did Arctic as an idea. Here we've got Arctic as an ecosystem.
What you're looking at here is obviously this is tundra. Most people would call it low Arctic tundra, and the reason you would is because you can see the brush sticking up through it. If you were there during the summer, it'd be green, and it'd be wet because there's permafrost underneath it, and it is actually quite a rich environment. And you're looking south towards the Brooks Range, and in fact, the pipeline that comes from Prudhoe Bay is, I don't know just where that picture was taken, but Toolik Lake itself is a couple of miles from the pipeline. So until 1964, there wasn't anything here. Toolik Lake now is the U.S.'s really biggest terrestrial ecological study center, and I hate to go there because it's crawling with lots and lots of people who run up there with lots of instrumentation and take all kinds of samples and take them back to their labs and go back to the University of Oklahoma or something like that, not to pick on them, and just somehow don't seem to me to belong there. This is obviously done by Russians, and they tend to look at things a little bit differently than we do. So what they're calling barren lands is hard to brown there.
Yeah.
It's hard to say exactly whose bright idea that was or what it means, but it does cover a lot of the area that has been heavily glaciated and therefore has been scoured down to bedrock, and it does look pretty barren. You go over to the same sort of climatic and situation in Alaska, say, and much of Alaska never was glaciated, and so it has a very different aspect to it, and it certainly doesn't look anywhere near as barren. So well, I hadn't seen that map before. That fits in there pretty well. Again, you can see that on the American side, and particularly the Canadian side, there's a very large amount of terrestrial tundra. On the Russian side, there's very little. In fact, the boreal forest, by that definition, it seems kind of odd. It really should extend a lot farther south. Most of you know about Lake Baikal, which is that very large lake that's just on the far right. And I think almost everybody would agree that Lake Baikal was in the boreal forest region. It certainly has a boreal climate. In fact, I've worked quite a bit south of there in Mongolia, and it's certainly part of the circumpolar north down there. Actually, it's kind of interesting. That is, I didn't realize it was before, but this is Dryas. So you've been hearing a lot about the younger Dryas, which is that last cold spell at the end of the Ice Age. It makes it into the climate change literature a lot. And 25 years ago, there probably weren't 50 people in the U.S. that knew what the younger Dryas was, and now any climatically literate person probably does. Well, it's named after Dryas, and Dryas is a very distinctive Arctic plant, which you can find it in old deposits because the leaves are very distinctive, and they're very obdurate. They withstand a lot of mistreatment. So when you find Dryas leaves, you know you had Dryas around. That's usually indicative of a cold climate. I remember once they were finding some and digging a new building in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They came up with a bunch of Dryas leaves. So obviously you had a deposit going back into the glacial age. And you had that picture up of the University of the Arctic a minute ago, and the logo for the University of the Arctic is this sort of circumpolar map with petals of a plant, of a flower hanging down over it. Well, they're petals of a Dryas flower, and Dryas's Latin name is Dryas octopetala, which means 8 petals. And if you count those, they look like misformed Dryases with a couple of extra petals maybe, but mostly it has 8 petals, which is kind of unusual. And since there are 8 Arctic nations, I was actually in on this selection of the Dryas flower as being the logo for the University of the Arctic. So there it is.
Does the presence of the Dryas flower indicate that they're pollinators, they're bees and such?
They're mostly bee pollinated. A lot of these things are they can self-pollinate, but they like to be bee-pollinated. And as you're probably aware, bumblebees really are found all over the Arctic. Bumblebees are very much of an Arctic beast, and so you'll come out and you'll find in Ellesmere Island or someplace you'll see bumblebees pollinating these things. The other thing about them is that they look to us white. They actually transmit, or not transmit, but reflect a lot of UV light, so that draws the bumblebees. And another thing about them is they're actually a pretty good reflector. Those white petals are sort of a reflecting surface, and they actually heat the pistil of the plant up by maybe a couple of degrees, just enough. If you're that close to the edge of physiological ability to produce seeds, that extra couple of degrees on those long summer nights can make the difference. I think this is probably Toolik Lake again. And so now you're seeing it in the fall, which in this case is probably August, maybe early August. In fact, that's alpine bearberry in the ground there. You can find that on the top of Mount Washington, for example, and looking down into the Brooks Range. And that white stuff there they call termination dust. That's when the USGS people all go home back to their labs in California. Another thing there that you probably would be a hard time noticing unless you're sort of versed in this. But what I'm looking at there, just below the mountains, or actually in the sort of middle distance, is a lot of evidence of glaciation. What you're seeing there is a lot of moraines, and it's material that's been brought out by glaciers from the Brooks Range at an earlier time when the glaciers were more extensive. And I hadn't seen that before, but that type of landscape is just once you get used to looking for it, you can pick it out very well. You also have some a lot of that growth there is actually shrubs, and as well as dwarf bearberry, alpine bearberry. A lot of that is willow. A lot of it is willow, is 2-inch tall willows. If you dig it up, if you try to pull up a twig of it, you find it's actually sort of a tree growing, but just barely on the surface of the ground from a big thick trunk somewhere. Oh yeah, this is trying to think of his name. Skip.
Calf.
Say again.
Calf. Circumpolar.
Yeah, no, Skip Walker.
Oh, Skip Walker
is the guy who's been doing this for a long time and is an expert on circumpolar vegetation patterns, and he interprets the Arctic in a very narrow sense. So you can see here that he doesn't have very much tundra at all. In Norway, for example, or in Scandinavia, the only tundra is this little tiny green strip right there around Vardo in Norway, and even most of Alaska, for example, is not tundra. There's a huge amount of information in this, and this map is something you can get a hold of. If anybody finds himself getting really turned on by the Arctic, you should get a copy of this thing and hang it on your wall and stare at it, and it's a whole course right there. And that one immediately recognizes the Lena River Delta, which it turns out is actually not a delta, or at least most of it is not a delta, but it's typical of a whole series of rivers in Russia, and I think this is going to come on another slide you had there. The Lena Delta was the one that says 525 on it. So it's one of the biggest of them, but you can see there's a couple other rivers that even have, this is discharge into the Arctic Ocean. And so if you see that compared to, say, the Yukon, which really isn't into the Arctic Ocean, or the Mackenzie, there's just an enormous amount of river discharge into the Arctic Ocean from Russia. And you can well imagine the amount of junk that comes down those rivers into the ocean. But it also provides some other things that it actually, there's so much somewhat warm water coming from the temperate latitudes, or at least the low Arctic, the boreal regions, into the Arctic Ocean by these rivers that actually to some degree even helps keep some of the some of the ice away from the shore. And this is part of the reason why the northern sea route works. Permafrost, there's another one we can spend a couple hours on. Let's see what we can dispose of it in a couple of minutes. I can tell pretty sure that that's somewhere in Russia, along the north coast there, that area I was just talking about. What's happened there is that there are enormous deposits of ice under the surface of the tundra. And this stuff is melting away very rapidly, and you don't hear too much about it. Fortunately, the ice is pure enough to where you're not sending out a lot of CO2. But what you're doing is losing huge amounts of countryside every year. And if you fly over that stuff, you realize that just literally thousands of square miles in a relatively short time are just washing away. So that's just one kind of permafrost. And what you're looking at here is a map of the permafrost in the world. I didn't even see the legend. I can tell just by looking at it, because what happens here, you'll notice how enormous the area of permafrost is in Russia. And this map's a little bit misleading, because among other things, it leaves out all of China, and you'd be surprised. But roughly 25% of all China is underlain by permafrost. You don't think of it as being a cold region. But permafrost, of course, is different from the forests depend on the summer temperature. The permafrost depends on the annual temperature. And also it depends on a historical factor. If the countryside has been glaciated, the glaciers actually keep the cold from penetrating down into the underlying material. So most of Canada was glaciated, most of Russia was not. And as I say, this is a little bit misleading, but what you're looking at in Russia is this very cold annual climate, but also a long period of time when there's never been any insulating glaciers there. So you're looking at permafrost that probably developed hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so, of course, again, when you think of it melting out, you're thinking of something being released into the atmosphere that hasn't been available for a long time. Well, there's again a lot more to be said there, but very interesting.
In Yakutsk, the place where it's so cold, -47 on Sunday, there is an Institute of Permafrost, and you go down this amazing, it's like going into a coal mine. You get all suited up, and you go down and down and down and down, and you keep going. It's all ice. It's quite, they do serious studies. They use the permafrost as the foundations for their buildings. They set their pillars down into the permafrost. Lots of country people have that's their refrigerator. They harvest ice from the river and keep them in the permafrost cellars. So it's part of a way of life as well.
Rangifertarandus, that means reindeer, or it means caribou. They're all the same species now. This is one of the best examples of a single circumpolar species. They're like any species is that widespread. They're sort of different races, if you will, but they're all. If you turn any of them loose among each other, they will interbreed very, very nicely. If you go up to a place like Svalbard, you'll find all the reindeer have very short legs because there's no wolves on Svalbard, and so there's nothing to chase them, so they don't have to run very fast. There's a lot of interesting stuff about caribou and reindeer. For example, there are reindeer carcasses on Franz Josef Land, and there are native reindeers that just sit here on Svalbard. They did some DNA studies, and it turns out that the Franz Josef Land reindeer caribou are from Greenland, so it's appropriate to call them caribou, I guess, rather than from Svalbard. And so how these things decided to take off across several hundred miles of frozen Arctic Ocean is an interesting question. Anyhow, anywhere in this Arctic and subarctic, unless you're on an isolated island, you have a very isolated island, you have reindeer or caribou. And so to me, they've always been a really good indication of what is the circumpolar north. And you'll see they come down now into Newfoundland. But as recently as the 20th century, there was a caribou herd in Maine. And when I was a kid, I remember getting my first hunting license here in Vermont. And one of the rules was that you were not allowed to shoot any caribou. And I don't suppose there were ever very many caribou in Vermont, but it always made me feel good that I was part of the circumpolar north in caribou country, even down here in Vermont.
I have a friend who is Finnish American, and she works for the National Guard and gets sent often to Scandinavia to do kind of emergency preparedness courses. And her goal is to import some Finnish reindeer into the Northeast Kingdom. She would really like to do that. But reindeer actually give you a really good way to segue into the Arctic as homeland, because really the ways that people have lived in the north, either hunting caribou or herding reindeer or hunting reindeer, have been one of the ways that human beings have been able to make their ways in the circumpolar world. And I'm going to talk here about, there are about 4 million people in, depending on how you define the Arctic, but an agreed upon number by the Arctic Council, about 4 million people in the north, and about 1 million of those are indigenous. So it's about 25%. You'll see some images towards the end of this show that show it, in different places the percentage is much higher. But it's a very interesting thing that in the late 20th and early 21st century, the United Nations has had 2 international decades of indigenous people. And the Inuit, with their amazing range, you can see the blue here is all Inuit people. They, with the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami, who are in, well, really it's this piece right up here in the north of Fennoscandia, have been leaders at the United Nations. The Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People was signed by all attendees except the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which felt that we had an awful lot that the guidelines of the Declaration of Indigenous Rights were counter to national imperatives. We have since signed it, and I believe Australia is the only country still waiting to sign it, but I should check that data. But it's especially interesting that it has been northern indigenous people whose long-standing political associations have had such a strong voice on the international stage. Many of the indigenous people that we have met are very articulate, very practiced in several worlds, their own indigenous ways, but also in Western ways and in international fora as well. So here we have, you can see that this distribution roughly mirrors the definitions that we saw of the Arctic as ecosystems, as geography. And the first group I want to talk about are the Uralic peoples. So the Urals run pretty much up the center here, right? See where the Nenets are there? That's the Yamal Peninsula. And they are the old dividing line between Europe and Asia. But the Uralic peoples are on both sides of the Urals. To the west, you have Finno-Ugric peoples, which include Sami, Finns, Karelians, Ingrians, Hungarians, but they're down there. The Nenets, the Komi, the Hanti, the Mansi. And the interesting thing about these people is it is the brown bear. These are the people of the bear, which is kind of their emblematic creature. Nonetheless, you also see among the Sami and the Nenets are important reindeer herding people. And in one of the things that you immediately see when you start to look at resource development is competition for drilling or reindeer passage. This is a picture here from Narian Mara, which is a Nenets community, and it was by Tula Tuisku, who's done a lot of work with the Nenets and their, especially among the women. These are 2 women from that area. And here we have a young Sami woman in a church in Jokkmokk in North Sweden. The reason I like this is because this is a Sami church. The pastor is Sami. He's been trained in Sweden, but he gives all of his sermons in Sami. And it's a very, very important social and political church for them. The other thing is that there are indigenous prophets among the Sami that are pictured in some of these motifs here. And the relationship between, in Scandinavia, the Lutheran Church was the state church up until the 1990s. So unless you belonged to the Lutheran Church, you did not have citizenship. So it was a very powerful tool of assimilation. But in some ways, the Sami were able to take and to co-opt that assimilationist thing by claiming the language of their sermons and by very valuable work in the translation of the Bible. I have a friend who is on the Sami Bible Translation Committee. They've been working on it for, I think it's almost 20 years now. But they look at the original translations that were made in the late 19th century by stewards of the Swedish state. And if you compare the translations side by side, it's incredibly interesting to see how very fine distinctions in the way of expressing Christian belief change from that idea of you must belong to this state church to we are claiming these spiritual beliefs as our own. Oh, that could be its own talk, definitely, too. Another group that we can look at are the Altaic people, which are the brown ones. And perhaps the 2 that I would like to point out in particular are the Evenk and the Even. They are distinct people, although they came from similar origins, but for both of them, reindeer herding has been an important emphasis. The Evenk are here, and the Dolgan and Naganasan are also reindeer herders. Dolgan are a combination of Naganasan and Evenk, so they are kind of a new indigenous people that has come out of sharing their livelihoods and territories. You also have the Saka, who are Altaic, and they are a really interesting group because in some ways they are conquerors. The Even and Evenk, the Dolgan, the Naganasan were already established in this vast expanse of Siberia, and the Sakha came from the south. And because they were horse breeders, they had a different economy, and they also had a much more stratified society. So one of the things that you see now in Siberia is many times there are Sakha in important national posts, whereas the Yukagir and the Even and the Evenk are often sidelined because of lack of education or lack of access to resources. We could spend time, quite a lot of time, in this set of peoples, and as well as the Chukchi and the other isolates, really, really interesting to look at in terms of Sovietization, in terms of what the centralized government in Moscow wanted to do with indigenous peoples. There are parallels, of course, in North America with residential schools and with the forced relocation of communities. There are parallels, but the details are different in important ways. This is a log house in Yakutsk, where they're building really, really rapidly, and many of these are falling down quite a bit, but there's beautiful construction. And it's a very interesting hybrid, really, of Russian peasant architecture that was adapted by indigenous peoples in Siberia. Of course, Yakutsk was one of the first places of the penal colonies of the Tsars. So they came here, and many of them stayed. So you have very well-established Russian and indigenous peoples that are their own class of quite successful entrepreneurs and leaders in the society. This is a poster, and it's advertising diamonds. There are tremendous resources in Siberia: diamonds, coal, oil, and we see quite a lot of very, very interesting political dynamics. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Sakha leaders realized we are claiming the resources that are on our territory. It's a huge, huge republic, the Sakha Republic, and there were a lot of diamonds, and this idea of this fact of quite a lot of wealth in the territory was something that they used to develop their education, their transportation infrastructure, their health care, a lot of the rural education as well. But the reason I like this is because this is a Sakha woman with diamonds in her ears, and she is so beautiful, just very gorgeous. This is an image from the Nanai, who are also Altaic peoples, but on the maritime coast. So they're mostly fishermen, and you could say that they're people of the salmon, and very skillful fishermen with strong identity, and still a lot of shamanic practices among them. As we know, that could be its own course. And then you have a number of what are called isolates. You've got the Karak, the Chukchi, and the Koryaks, in the Yukagir, which we haven't definitively decided if they belong to a particular linguistic group or not. And it's quite interesting to see what those are. In this one, we have the blue is the distribution of the Inuit, all the way across Alaska, including the Aleutians, and here all the way to Greenland. So in the world, this is the largest geographic distribution of a single indigenous population. And as I mentioned before, they've had a really important voice in international affairs. This picture here, this fellow here, one of my favorite people on earth, his name is Sperry Ash, and he is Sukpiak from the south of Alaska. He's a ritual dancer, and he came to Russian school at Norwich University because he wanted to learn Russian so that he could understand the service in the Orthodox Church. And he struggled mightily at learning Russian, but he had so much that he had memorized. He was able to take that and use it. So Sperry's now in his 30s. He's married a lovely woman from Bethel, Alaska, who great at smoking salmon, and they have 3 little girls. So they're both public school teachers. So as I watch his family grow, you can see how this young man, whose mother had 2 years of education, he's had a college education, and he is teaching his kids, and he's doing a lot to integrate Native knowledge into his teaching. We also have the pink. These are Athabascan people. And again, you have two major populations of Athabascan people, some here across interior Alaska and boreal Canada, but also in the American Southwest. Although Algonquian people are not necessarily included in many definitions of northern peoples, I like to do it because we get a lot of students from these areas at the University of the Arctic. And having them written out of the agenda is not something that I think is important. So you've got Abenaki is an Algonquian language. Algonquin is an Algonquian language too. So you've got, when you think of these groups as language families, it makes you see, instead of very small tribes that are not related necessarily, you can begin to think of them as belonging to, well, like you were talking about circumpolarity, about Rangifer Tarandus, about people having similar interests rather than being divided by a variety of things. I've got a couple more things here, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions, but I want to end with an image that shows you some of the major population centers, and this is very expressive of the difference between North America and Russia. So what you're getting with these big blue things is population centers. You can see how Russia is far more populated, really, than the Canadian Arctic, and how Alaska is more populated than Greenland, for instance. So there are quite a lot of differential between population centers in different places. There are a number of cities, over 1 million, in Russia, in the Arctic.
It's probably worth pointing out too that Anchorage is a lot farther south than most of those other. Most people would not think of Anchorage as being, it's certainly not Arctic. It's whereas Norilsk or something is.
Yeah. And this one takes each of the Arctic 8s and shows the proportions of indigenous populations, which are the kind of mustard-colored parts of the pie. So if you look at Greenland, you can see that the majority of the population is, in fact, Kalaallisut, indigenous. In Canada, what we're looking at with that population is, I believe, north of the 60 degrees latitude. And in these areas of Fennoscandia, they're only looking at the northernmost provinces. And this one does a little bit of the same thing, but it shows you some of the distribution of people that we've talked about.
It also points out the ancient question of, are Icelanders indigenous or not? There wasn't anybody there before them, so.
And the Faroese have the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's some recent stuff indicating that there were people there before the Faroese. Irish monks, probably.
So, coming to the end, and this is an image from a University of the Arctic graduation ceremony. This was in Buda in North Norway. And you have students from all over the circumpolar world. They had traveled from Arkhangelsk, from Murmansk, from Yakutsk, from Saskatoon, from Whitehorse, and from someplace in British Columbia. So this was one cohort, this was one graduating class that came together, and it was a really great ceremony. And I like the idea of empowering people with knowledge, not just the indigenous people of the area, but all people. This is a fascinating region. There's so much to know. And the other thing about looking at the circumpolar world is by examining it closely, it gives us a way to re-examine the ways we are in the world, I think, in important ways. How do we use our resources? How do we make our livelihoods? How do we interpret our landscape? So I think we'll close with this picture, and maybe turn on the lights, and we've got time for a few questions, and that's just about it.
China has come up a couple of times. There was an article in the New York Times today or the day before talking about somebody had done a study on Chinese pollution hitting the Pacific coast of the U.S., which means one way or another that same airflow must be bringing it up to, or something's bringing it up to the Arctic too.
In the 1960s, there was a bright idea of peaceful use of atomic devices, and so they thought, well, let's go up to Alaska and try some of these out. What we'll do is Alaska needs a harbor up here, so let's use some hydrogen bombs and blow up a chunk of Alaska and make a harbor there. Well, fortunately, they never did it, but and also fortunately, they provided a certain amount of money to the University of Alaska, and this is a story in itself, which I won't get into, to make some studies of the area that they were going to blow up. And so they went out there and started studying it. One of the things they found is you started putting Geiger counters on the local Inuit, Eskimo, whatever you want to call them, whatever they want to call themselves, and there are a lot of clicks coming out of there. These people had a very high level of radiation. So what had happened? Well, to make a long story short, it turns out that the Chinese at that time were still doing above ground testing. And this stuff was coming over to Alaska, airborne, landing on the tundra, and the tundra is largely, much of the surface of the tundra is lichen. That's what the reindeer eat, a lot of this lichen. The lichen is very slow growing. So it makes this sort of ground cover. It picks up all the stuff coming down, and so the lichen is highly radioactive, by not highly in the sense of Chernobyl or something, but significantly raised. The caribou eat the lichen, the people eat the caribou, and here in this totally, at that time, almost untouched environment and culture are people getting levels of radionuclides, nucleotides that were high enough to be alarming, let's say. There's a lot more to that story. It's a good one. Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to be in the Arctic in the winter and the summer. It was something I noticed in the summer trip that you brought up points about, and that was the compression in time and space. We were paddling north on the Burnside River above the Arctic Circle into the Coronation Bay. And of course you mentioned the permafrost. That was the limit in the bottom. And ice, snow, wind was the limit in the top. Everything was compressed in space into this small trees and everything. Yeah. And then time. When we started out, we would see the Dryas octopetala in bud. And another day it would be open, and in 3 days it would be in seed. Everything alive had to do what it was doing really fast and low.
About June 10th to July 10th to summer.
Right.
Well, why don't we thank you very much. We'll be here for a little bit, but thank you very much for coming on this cold night.